I'd like to begin. First of all, Idris is going to hand out some sheets, which I'll be referring to during my presentation. I'd like to begin with a quote from one of our great rabbis, Hillel, who said, "Lo habayshan lamed," which means the shy person does not learn. So, in other words, don't be shy. If you have questions, please ask them. If you have something to add, please add it. And I'm going to make sure you're not going to be shy by sort of starting by throwing this out to you. One of the questions we're supposed to be talking about this afternoon is, what is mysticism? And I'm going to ask you that. You all signed up for a session on mysticism. What is it that you thought we were going to talk about this afternoon? We'll see whether what I have to say and what our other presenters have to say corresponds to that. So does anyone want to begin? Go ahead.
Which we can't talk about.
Okay, well, now we can all go. Okay, anyone else? Carol?
The inner experience of spirituality.
Okay, good. Anybody else?
Practice of searching for that inner spirituality.
Okay.
A feeling of hiddenness or mystery.
Okay. Okay, any others? Now I think you'll find in the history of Jewish mysticism the hiddenness and mystery are definitely there. The inner spirituality is there too, although perhaps not as much as in some of the other traditions. And did you want to say something? There are a couple of features of Jewish mysticism that I'd like to mention. The first is that it's, as compared to other forms of mysticism, it's largely text-based. I mean, we don't think of mysticism as being text-based necessarily. That kind of inner spirituality, the emphasis that mystics have on experience, sort of isn't as prevalent in Jewish mysticism, although it's certainly not entirely absent. Another feature, now the sort of description of what we're talking about this afternoon said that it would be through stories, lives, a couple of other things, and I'm going to do it primarily through lives. I'm going to talk about five figures in Jewish history who played a role in the development of mysticism, and sort of representing 5 different periods. And then there's a 6th person that I'm also going to mention who played a somewhat different role. Now, it so happens that all 6 of those people are male. I think if, certainly in Christian mysticism, there's the women mystics of the Middle Ages are certainly, to me, a very big part of that story. And in Islamic mysticism, we have figures like Rabia, who played a big part in the founding of the Sufi tradition. There's nothing comparable in Judaism, and I don't really know why that is. But the fact is that it has been, the history that I'm going to be talking about, which sort of goes from roughly the 2nd century to the 18th century, the major figures in it are all male. So our first figure is Rabbi Akiva. And he was a rabbi of the late first, early second century, one of the major figures in the development of the Mishnah and the Talmud. And along with their sort of legal and scholarly work, many of the scholars at that time also engaged in what was known as Kabbalah and Mysticism. I'll write that word. The word Merkaba means chariot. Now, if you look at the first page of your handout, you'll see an excerpt from Ezekiel's vision in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. The Merkaba mysticism developed because certainly in the Hebrew Bible, there's not much that is actually said about the nature of God. I mean, if you look at, for example, the first verse of the Bible, which is usually translated, "In the beginning God created heaven and earth." There are other translations, but in all those translations, the word God is just sort of taken for granted. It doesn't tell us where God came from or what God is. I mean, we find out certain characteristics of God. God can create. God creates through speech, and then there are other things that develop in later stories. But our sense of what that God is very thin. And one of the few places where there's more of a sense, more of a developed sense of what heaven looks like, and what you see there, and God's throne, and the chariot in which God rides, is in that first chapter of Ezekiel. It's a very different character from most of what you find in the Hebrew Bible. So the mystics, people wanted to know, like, what is this God? What is it? What is heaven? What does God look like? What do we find around God? And so the first chapter of Ezekiel provided an object to contemplate, to sort of think about all those things. So now, as I mentioned, Rabbi Akiva was one of the rabbis of the Talmudic period, and I chose him for essentially 3 reasons. The first reason is that he is unquestionably one of the most outstanding personalities in Jewish history. I mean, his story is fascinating. I mean, he was, how much of this is truth and how much of it is legend is sort of hard to say, but there's, I think scholars generally recognize at least a kernel of truth, that he was, in his youth, an illiterate shepherd, and he worked for a wealthy landowner, and he and the landowner's daughter fell in love with each other. And she recognized in him intelligence and potential as a scholar, even though he was illiterate and had contempt for scholars. And so she agreed to marry him if he would go and study. Her father was opposed to the match and cut his daughter off. So they were very poor, but she sold her hair so that he could go and study. And it was initially very difficult for him, but he spent years studying, and first mastered the alphabet, and then mastered the Torah, and eventually became one of the great scholars of his age. The second thing about Rabbi Akiva If you look at the bottom of the first page, you'll see the story of the four who entered the Pardes. Pardes, it's the Hebrew word for orchard, but it comes from a Persian word, and it's the same word from which we get the English word paradise. So the rabbis taught, four entered the Pardes. They were Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai gazed and died. Ben Zoma gazed and was harmed. Acher cut down the plantings. Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and left in peace. So the Pardes is the world of mystical speculation. So these four rabbis, all of whom were sort of great rabbis of their time, engaged in this speculation. One of them, Ben Azai, died as a result. Ben Zoma, it says, was harmed and he went mad. Now, Acher cut down the plantings. Who was Acher? The word Acher in Hebrew means other. So, this is from the Talmud, and the people who wrote it didn't even want to mention his name. His name was Elisha ben Abuya, and he became an apostate as a result of this speculation. There's a novel about him in which he becomes a student of Greek philosophy and sort of rejects everything Jewish. So the only one of the four who was sort of spiritually whole enough to be able to withstand the effect of this kind of mystical speculation was Rabbi Akiva. And this will give you some idea of the way the mystical tradition has been regarded by mainstream Judaism. It's definitely part of the Jewish tradition, but it's regarded with considerable skepticism and wariness. There's a tradition that no one should study the mystical tradition until they're 40 years old and have a thorough grounding in sort of the standard sources. Okay, now the third reason for sort of singling out Rabbi Akiva, there's a book by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's one of the great scholars of the 20th century, and it's only within the last few years that it's been translated into English. The English title is Heavenly Torah as Refracted Through the Generations. And what Heschel does is he takes two strains in sort of Jewish thought that he traces back to Akiva and to his contemporary Rabbi Ishmael. And the Ishmaelian tradition is rational, measured, moderate. The Akivan tradition is passionate, extravagant, sometimes extreme. And from the Ishmaelian tradition, like as that sort of develops into the Middle Ages, we get the philosophical tradition identified with Maimonides, and from the Akivan tradition we get the mystical tradition. So just to give you an example of the difference between the two, and a lot of it sort of centers on interpretation of the Torah. So for the Ishmaelians, the sort of main principle was the Torah is written in the language of human beings. In other words, while this is our sacred text, we sort of analyze it and treat it as we would any other text. For Akiva, the main principle is that every word, and in fact, every letter of the Torah has meaning. So, and even if a letter is written larger in the Torah scroll, or written smaller, or if there's a yud there where there might not be, a small letter where you don't read it, that can have meaning. So there are many other, so another difference would be in terms of the sacrifices. For Rabbi Ishmael, the sacrifices are there because human beings need them as a way of getting close to God. For Akiva, the sacrifices are there because God really wants the sacrifices. So, and this is like an 800-page book that sort of traces all kinds of dualities of that sort. So it's from the Akivan tradition that the mystical tradition develops. Okay, now to move on to our second personality, we go ahead about 1,000 years to the Middle Ages in Spain, and our personality is Moses de Leon. And the book that he's associated with is the Zohar. Now, when I say it's the book he's associated with, exactly what his relationship to it is, it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to a Hasidic Jew, they will tell you that the Zohar was written by Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a disciple of Rabbi Akiva's and one of the great scholars of the next generation. So in other words, who lived in the middle of the 2nd century, but that it was hidden for 1,000 years until it somehow made its way to Spain and was discovered by Moses de Leon. Modern scholarship, and especially the greatest modern scholar of mysticism, Gianottie, regards Moses de Leon as being, in fact, the author of the Zohar, who attributed it to Shimon Bar Yochai. But in any case, now, at that time, Spain was the center of the Jewish world. This is like late 13th, beginning of the 14th century. So Moses de Leon was a writer, bookseller in northern Spain who began circulating these texts. It wasn't like the whole Zohar is a hugely sprawling work. Shalom it's like 22 different parts of it. I mean, to call it a book is a bit like calling the Hebrew Bible a book. It's much more than that. So he didn't sort of circulate it all at a time. He circulated little bits of it, saying that it was a recently discovered text from Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, to add to the authenticity of it, the text was in Aramaic, which was not a language that was used at all in Spain at that time, except for studying sort of ancient texts. The Babylonian Talmud is in Aramaic. But nobody spoke or wrote in Aramaic. Jews mostly spoke in Hebrew, or if they were writing for a general audience, in Arabic. So the story goes that around that time, the Mamluks conquered the town of Akkad in northern Israel. And the story goes that a man named Isaac, who many Jews were massacred as a result of the conquest, but Isaac escaped and found his way to Spain. And he heard about Moses de Leon and this text that he had supposedly discovered, which, you know, Isaac was from Israel. He had never heard of this text, which is supposedly written in Israel, so he wanted to find out about it. And he met Moses de Leon, and Moses Leon said, come to my house, which is in a different town, and I'll show you the text. But as it turned out, by the time Isaac was able to do that, Moses had fallen ill and died. So he met Moses' wife instead. And when he asked about this text, the response of Moses' wife is worth reading. Thus and more may God do to me if my husband ever possessed such a book. He wrote it entirely from his own head. When I saw him writing and nothing in front of him, I said to him, why do you say that you're copying from a book when there's no book? You're writing from your head. Wouldn't it be better to say so? You would have more honor. He answered me, if I told them my secret, that I'm writing from my own mind, they would pay no attention to my words and they would pay nothing for them. They would say he's inventing them out of his imagination. But now that they hear that I'm copying from the book of Zohar, composed by Rabbi Shimon, son of Yochai, through the Holy Spirit, they buy these words at a high price, as you see. So whether it was for such crass reasons or whether Moses Leon really believed that he was sort of channeling the Shimon Bar Yochai, this we don't know for sure, but in any case, the idea that Shimon Bar Yochai was the author sort of took root, and as I say, is still believed in many Orthodox circles. Now, what is in the Zohar? The main contribution of the Zohar is the system of Sfirot. And if you look at the second page, you'll see the diagram of the Sfirot. So in this system, the sort of essence of God is what is called Ein Sof, which means no end. And Ein Sof is not something we can perceive, but there are emanations of God that sort of go into the world, and these are the Sfirot. And there you see, and they're always in some kind of diagram. And if you do a Google image search for Sfirot, you'll see hundreds of different diagrams of this sort, and sometimes it's in the form of a tree, sometimes it's in a human form, but it sort of takes basically this form. And the Sfirot, as you sort of proceed downward in the Sfirot, they become more concrete and more perceptible. And yeah,
Just 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So then we come to Malchut, which is the one that we perceive most directly. Malchut is also called the Shekhinah, the presence of God. In any case, I've got to sort of go over the other personalities very quickly, but that's the sort of system of Sfirot. Okay, so our third personality is, we go another couple of hundred years later to the town of Tzfat in northern Israel. Now, during that period, in 1492, a very traumatic event happened, which was the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which had been the center of Jewish life for nearly half a millennium. And the Jews of Spain sort of scattered through the Mediterranean world. And the Kabbalists, the mystics, they gathered in Tzfat. And so there was a whole school of Kabbalists there, of whom the most famous is Isaac Luria. And he was in Tzfat for only 3 years until his death at the age of 38. He wrote no books. and yet his influence was huge. He was sort of constantly just bubbling with ideas all the time, many of which were written down by his followers and colleagues, and they gradually spread from Sfat and became very influential. The primary way in which Luria developed further developed the ideas of Kabbalah that he had inherited from the Zohar and other Spanish texts was that in his system, all Jews became actors in the cosmic drama. There was, because of that sense of having been exiled, the idea of exile that had always been present was sort of further developed, and the idea of the exile of the Shekhinah, that there was a certain alienation between one part of God and other parts of God were developed. And the way to correct that was through what was called tikkun olam, which means repairing or correcting the world. And tikkun olam, and the way we did that was through the observance of mitzvot, of commandments. So what we did became of cosmic significance. There was also an infusion of Messianism into Luria's Kabbalah, and that leads to our fourth personality, Shabtai Tzvi. Who, in the 17th century, many Jews believed was the Messiah. There have been messianic claimants throughout Jewish history, but none have had the impact on the Jewish world that Shabtai Tzvi did. It was again the impact of the expulsion from Spain was still being felt. There were also pogroms at that time in Poland and the Ukraine. So the yearning for a Messiah was very strong. Shabtai Tzvi was a very charismatic personality. He also had a prophet named Nathan of Gaza, who was a very clever publicist. Shabtai Tzvi's messianic adventure ended with his being put in prison by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And at a certain point, he was offered the choice between death and conversion to Islam. And he chose conversion to Islam. And even this didn't, many of his followers sort of fell away at that time, but some persisted. So I'll just very quickly go on to our fifth personality, the Baal Shem Tov. Who was the founder, or at least the sort of inspirational founder of the Hasidic movement in the 18th century. And he was a sort of saintly personality, and he developed the idea that's sort of primarily associated with him is the idea of devekut, which means clinging to God. And so here is where we get that idea of union with God that's sort of very common in mystical systems. Like Isaac Luria, he wrote no books, but his followers sort of developed and transmitted his ideas. And even though Hasidism today, we associate it as the most orthodox and in some ways rigid branch of Judaism. Early Hasidism was a sort of flowering of Jewish spirituality that have had few parallels. So that brings the story up to the 18th century. The rest is going to be for Rabbi Cohen to develop in 3 weeks.
I want to begin with a poem by a contemporary poet. I expect some of you know of her, Mary Oliver. And I begin with a poem by Mary Oliver because I would call her a mystic, and also because she grounds this sense of the presence of the divine in everyday life. So this is not a mysticism for a chosen few who live at a higher level, but this is for all of us. So she writes, it's called Thirst. Another morning, and I wake with thirst for the goodness I do not have. I walk out to the pond, and all the way God has given us such beautiful lessons. Oh Lord, I was never a quick scholar, but sulked and hunched over my books past the hour and the bell. Grant me, in your mercy, a little more time. Love for the earth and love for you are having such a long conversation in my heart. Who knows what will finally happen or where I will be sent? Yet already I have given a great many things away, expecting to be told to pack nothing except the prayers which, with this thirst, I am slowly learning. The first earlier Christian mystic than Mary Oliver I want to mention is from the 13th century, Meister Eckhart. And as soon as I give you this quotation, you will know why I chose it. Meister Eckhart teaches, every choice is a renunciation. So guess how much material we have all had to renounce in order to pack this talk into 25 minutes. So I know Marilyn will tell me when time is up. I think I'm close to 25 minutes. So every choice is a renunciation. At no time have I experienced the truth of this observation more keenly than in preparing this talk. Christian mysticism is a great treasure, stretching over more than 2,000 years. Add to that its deep roots in Jewish thought and writings, the influence of Greek philosophy, especially Plato, on Christian mysticism, and you and I would be good for a few years to study together, and then to seek to learn the common ground we share with all faiths. Well, would that you and I could do that, but not today. So here's a brief overview. But I'd first like to give a little bit of historical context, because Christian mysticism has tended to flourish when all the world, everything is in turmoil. And that's the reason you and I are here today, looking at mysticism in these three Abrahamic faiths. Every institution that you and I know about is in the midst of massive change, and we like to call it a paradigm change. The planet is in jeopardy as our way of living heats up the earth. Technology is changing the way you and I relate to one another and to our world. And I could go on about the changes we are in. History shows us that it is in such times that mysticism comes to the fore and flourishes. So that is not to say that mysticism is not always a thread running through these faiths, but that it tends to be looked for, inquiries are made, all those things happen. And that was certainly true in the first centuries of the Common Era. Mysticism flourished and continued with the rise of monasticism in the 5th and 6th centuries. And what was happening then? The rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and before that, Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire, its rise and fall. So an amazing flowering of mystical theology and practice grew out of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And then we could begin a long list in those first 500 years: Augustine, Origen, Evagrius, the Desert Mothers and Fathers, Cassian, Benedict. Again, we see the flourishing of mysticism at the end of the Middle Ages, when the contrast between courtly life, remember all those wonderful poems that you and I learned and read about, and the way of life, the contrast between the courtly life and the beggars and lepers at their doors was much like our time right now, except we say the contrast is between the 1% and the 99%, totally. Empire and church at the end of the Middle Ages were in turmoil, as well as in competition. There was a schism between the Latin Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and all of this strife, amazingly, gave rise to such mystics as Hildegard of Bingen, St. Francis, the English mystics, Richard Rolle, Marjorie Kemp, Walter Hilton, and of course, that 13th century Meister Eckhart. As the Black Death and the 100 Years' War moved across Europe, the cloud of unknowing was written by an anonymous mystic, and Julian of Norwich records her visions of God in the divine revelations. So here we come into modern time, or postmodern, as we're often told. In our time of great turmoil and strife, mysticism is being explored with increasing interest. With all our knowledge and scientific expertise, we humans still long for peace and justice, for meaning and purpose, for a sense of the transcendent. With the culture around us declaring that religion cannot help us, we look for wisdom and guidance. And one source of that wisdom and guidance, surprisingly, is actually an element of all religion. That is mysticism. So while many are skeptical and even hostile, as Bob mentioned, in the tradition he spoke about, we find the same in the Christian tradition of mysticism. Many are skeptical or hostile even, but the books are appearing. The poetry, art, and literature are expressing this wisdom. The contemplative path is sought, and the conversation is happening as here today. So a little bit about some general thoughts on mysticism from the Christian perspective. The word, Greek word, mysterion, which means mystery, is found 27 times in the Christian Testament. I think it's also helpful to note, alongside that understanding of mystery, is that the Greek word for truth is very different, has a very different meaning than the way we use it today. The Greek word for truth, aletheia, means something revealed. So it's very different from our use of the word truth as something verifiable by analysis, or truth as proven, often by science. So we have this mystery and we have this search for truth, but truth is revealed, not proven. Truth is what you and I seek to know as hidden, but can be revealed but not necessarily what I call able to be put in a box or containable by the human mind. Mysticism incorporates ancient wisdom tradition. Indeed, Jesus of Nazareth was known as a wisdom teacher in a long tradition of Jewish wisdom teachers. In some of that wisdom tradition, the early church teachers found in the Song of Songs, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Psalms, and then in the visionaries of the Hebrew scriptures, like Moses, Elijah, Ezekiel, Daniel, in the apocalyptic literature. And the early teachers also saw some of the roots in Greek philosophy. So we have a long lineage of spiritual teachings by those you and I describe as mystics. For sure, mysticism in the Christian perspective is experiential. But not everyone, especially writing about mysticism today, likes that word and prefers to talk about it as a conscious awareness of divine presence. Mysticism is anchored in values like humility, trust, simplicity, peacefulness. So if a mystic is asking you to go and follow him or her to foment some violence, they're not a mystic. It's about peacefulness. Mysticism in the Christian understanding takes place in the ordinary, concrete of daily life. Human life is the location of the unitive vision with God. Many in the church would also say mysticism is subversive because it undermines all our subtle ways of seeing things. Mysticism invites us to a whole new way of seeing everything. And a wonderful story in one of the great scriptural resources for Christian mysticism, which is the Gospel of John. But it's a wonderful story of this whole new way of seeing. And it's in John chapter 9, and it's the story of the man born blind. People know that story? Jesus and his followers come into a town. They see the man born blind, and he's begging. And the disciples say to Jesus, whose fault is this? Did his parents do something wrong? Or did he do something wrong that he was born this way? And Jesus says, that's not the way to look at this. That is not the question. When you encounter a situation like this, your first question is, where is God in this? So always the mystic says, look for God's presence. And especially in the very places where you would not expect God to be because of our usual lens that we wear to view the world. And then the whole story goes on to show that the man born blind has more sight. His sight is restored by Jesus. But his neighbors cannot see that he can now see. And they keep saying, well, you look like the same man, but you mustn't be. So the story goes on to continue saying, as John's Gospel says all the time, this is about being in the light and not the darkness. This is about the ability to see what you might not see if you do not look through these new eyes that Jesus shows you. Mysticism is always paradoxical. The more it reveals, the more it conceals. Not very satisfying for us who like to have it out there and be able to say, I've got it. Well, you won't be a happy mystic if you're looking for that. The more it reveals, the more it conceals. The bedroot of Christian mysticism lies in Jesus of Nazareth and his proclamation of the kingdom of God as a revelation of a mystery kept secret until now, that in Jesus, in proclaiming this kingdom of God, and remember the kingdom of God is not a place, it's a relationship. Not a place, but a relationship. And that this mystery that Jesus is revealing is for all people. It is revealed to all who will open their hearts and minds. And you often hear Jesus saying, waken up, be aware, take a look. What do you see before you? Open your eyes. So it's a great contrast to the Greek mystery religions, where only a select few could have access to the mysteries. Jesus of Nazareth, through his own mystical experiences, his own experience, consciousness, awareness of the presence of the divine in all of life, then shows his followers and those who come after that this is the fullness of human life, that you and I were created by love, by God, for love, and to love. And that this is the mystery, the secret, that God wants us to realize, that is, to make real. Some of the early Christian mystics like to refer to Jesus as our memory, as our memory, that he came to remind us of something that we already know and that is deep within us, because God is our source. But we forget and we get distracted, or we put God in certain rooms or areas where we go and visit once in a while, or we pray, but that God is not present in all of life. So mysticism, in the Christian perspective, is an ever-widening, expansive consciousness of divine presence as love. It is being open to the transformative power of that presence, and it is also meant to be shared. So mystics are not meant to say, lucky me, I've had this amazing experience of God. Aren't I wonderful? Not at all. Totally opposite. It is humbling, and it is unspeakable, as Douglas said earlier, that about which we cannot speak because there are no words to describe it. But it can be shown, much like Bob said, the emanations of God are shown in God's world. If you want to think about a story, you all know, I'm sure, of the transformative nature of an encounter with the divine. Think of Moses at the burning bush, and how Moses was transformed in that experience of divine. Moses, who was keeping the sheep, not with his own people, because he was running away from the Pharaoh and knew that he might be arrested. And so Moses, we might call him the fugitive at this point, is presented with the divine right there, present to him. And Moses is transformed into a great leader of God's people. And if you remember the part in the story where God says, I want you to go to the Pharaoh and tell him to set my people free. And Moses says, oh, I'm not a good speaker. I don't think I could do that. Well, guess what? Moses becomes a very good speaker, so much so that he even at one point on the Exodus journey gets the courage to speak to God on behalf of God's people who are not keeping faith very well, like all of us. So this encounter with the divine is always transformative. We think of St. Paul on the road to Damascus and his encounter and his sense of being spoken to by Christ. And Paul took 3 years to go away and sit and reflect on what that was all about and what was God was calling him to do. And he came back a transformed person, the bearer of a new vision, just as Moses came back to the Hebrews in Egypt and put this vision of God's liberation before the people. Mysticism is never static. It's always a dynamic process of ever deeper participation in the divine life. It is an attempt only to express and live a mystery, to live human life with God at the center, and to find the goal of human life in the unitive vision that we are all one in God. Because the divine is infinite, the mystical journey is infinite, ever deeper, ever more expansive into the mystery of God. The shape of the journey is spiral, the early mystical teachers tell us. So it's not A to B, but it's much like the Hebrews as they went through and became God's people of Israel in the wilderness. It looked like at times they were walking in circles. Well, so is our spiritual journey always. We often pass through the same issues, the same challenges, and they've been given title stages, but the tricky part is we have to remember it's spiral. It's not linear. So the early teachers said this mystical journey, this exploration into life with God at the center goes through purgation. In other words, there's a lot of baggage you and I have to let go of if we're going to really be open to God's presence. Illumination, where once in a while we say, I think I got that. I think I got that much. And then to that experience of union. One other key point in Christian mysticism is that mysticism is ecclesial. That is, it is church. That you are nourished and fed in all that is going to help you come into this sense of divine presence. You are nourished by the church, in the church, and the church is supposed to be a sign of God's love for the world. The church is supposed to be a presence of God in God's world. And every member is called to be a manifestation of the infinite love of God. And we always have to add in finite form, right? So we don't get confused. And it's one of the teachings we don't have time to get into today, that when we talk about union with God, well, does that mean the human becomes God? Obviously not. So another time we might explore that. Every member is called to be a manifestation of the infinite love of God, but that's always to be lived out in the concreteness of daily life. And Meister Eckhart again says, if you find yourself in a state of rapture with the divine presence, and someone comes to your door seeking food, you are to leave the rapture and give the person a cup of soup. So this is never, isn't this wonderful, but always meant to love and serve in God's name. There's nothing elitist about mystical experience. It's not reserved for the chosen few, nor is it an escape from humble service. The more authentic a mystic, the more engaged with the mundane. And Thomas Merton, who was a novice master for young monks coming in to Gethsemane, and he was teaching them part of their formation. And James Finlay, who wrote a book about Thomas Merton, The Palace of Nowhere, was a young novice. And he came in for his weekly spiritual direction, carrying Teresa of Avila's book, The Interior Castle. And he said to Thomas Merton, now, it's okay if you tell me I'm wrong, but I think I'm in the 4th room. And Thomas Merton said to him, you are to go out and work in the pig barn until I call you to come in again, and then we'll talk some more. And so it's always rooted in, and it's one of the authentic ways you and I, or one of the ways we understand authenticity in mysticism. Now, having said all that I've said, it's impossible to speak about all of this. There are 2 streams of thought in Christian mysticism, and one which says, well, all we have is language and symbols, and so we should say everything we can, and one that says we can only talk about what God is not. In other words, apophatic mysticism accepts the impossibility of speaking about the divine and acknowledges that you and I can only be receptive to the multitude of ways God reveals God's self to us. And then, hopefully, we need poetry, symbol, ritual. As in one more poem by a contemporary mystic. Was my time, Marilyn? Oh, I'm over. All right, I have to stop. All right. This is called The Inner History of a Day. We seldom notice how each day is a holy place, where the Eucharist of the ordinary happens, transforming our broken fragments into an eternal continuity that keeps us. Somewhere in us, a dignity presides that is more gracious than the smallness that fuels us with fear and force, a dignity that trusts the form a day takes. So at the end of this day, we give thanks for being betrothed to the unknown and for the secret work through which the mind of the day and wisdom of the soul become one. I'd be happy to talk some more, but you will. Thank you.
You know, it's funny that we have been speaking so much about God, and yet none of us have really invoked God. Not that we've forgotten God, not that we've been guilty of neglect in any way, but when I'm faced with the obligation to speak about something important, I always am best served by calling myself, not by calling God into our presence, but by calling myself to an awareness that we are in God's presence. And so we begin Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in the name of God, who is the loving nurturer of the creation, the Rahman, a word which is derived from the Arabic root for womb, the Rahman, the loving nurturer of the creation, the Rahim, the ever merciful. And so I begin by seeking refuge in the light of God's knowledge from my own ignorance, and seeking refuge in God's wisdom from words that are born of vanity and short-sightedness. And I seek refuge in God's forgiveness from all of the things that I've done, those destructive things to myself and to the environment and to the world, and all those things that I should have done and failed to do. And I begin by giving thanks for being in a room where Rabbi Akiva and Moses Benyon, Baal Shem Tov, and St. Francis, and so many other beautiful souls are mentioned and celebrated. And Julian of Norwich, whose vision of God, vision of Jesus, was that of a mother suckling at Jesus' breast. And so the subversiveness of the mystical experience is so powerfully palpable there. And it is indeed ironic that one of the first criteria of mysticism or mystical experience that William James gives us is ineffability. Like love, something we can't define, we are driven to speak about it. We're driven to find words for it. We're tortured by the power of the experience, so much so that we have to try to give it words, and yet the moment we do so, we realize that whatever we've put on paper is not that. And so, God willing, we will talk about ineffability and mystery and personal experience. I think really all of us, whether aware of it or not, have had some taste of mystical experience. If we've ever had a moment of prayer which took us outside of our awareness of time, if we've ever had a sudden insight in remembrance of God, if we've ever felt a sudden elevation of our spirit or joy in prayer, if we've ever had a sense of profound mystery after we've encountered a human being, I think we've had a taste of what mysticism really is. And before we get into the noetic, the knowledge or the insight, and before we get into the ineffability of these moments for which we're so desperate to find words and cannot, I'd like to tell a story. In the Middle East, for those of you who have been, and here I include very much those of you who have spent time in Israel, the Middle East is a place where it's just a fact that people make it their business to know more about you than you're normally accustomed to. So usually for me, from the taxi in from Amman, from the airport into the main city or anywhere I am, we've talked about my religion, we've talked about my marital status, we've talked about my fertility or my wife's fertility, how many children we've had, and if we haven't had very many, we're asked why, what's the problem, brother? My financial, how much money do you make? Are you CIA? Who's paying for your trip? All these kinds of questions that we would never dare to ask one another in America or in Canada. We're sometimes affronted by the directness of life in the Middle East. And I've even seen this, the reason why I include Israel here, because there are many ways in which Israel feels, in parts, like a very Western place. The beaches of Tel Aviv are not Middle Eastern, right? And there are places of the Middle East, the places of Israel that don't feel very Middle Eastern. But I've been in Israeli banks when the person at the window, we have that line at the pharmacy and at the bank where, you're just, even if you're hearing things, you're pretending you're not. And, unfortunately, with the recent scandals with our mayor in Toronto, we've heard things that we didn't really want to hear. But I've been in Israeli banks where the guy at the window is having some kind of financial problem, and the guy behind him in line will come up to the window and start getting involved. These events would horrify us, in Canada, really. And so, in the Middle East, when, I've been there studying, and even at times when my Arabic got really good, so much so that the taxi driver would ask me where these other people are from, and so there have been moments when, I've been in the groove, and at this point I was taking graduate courses in Islamic law and Islamic sciences at the University of Jordan. I was the only American in any of my classes. All my classes were in Arabic, and I just tried to keep a very low profile, right? I just went to class, I did my readings, I came home with headaches because I'd never been immersed in such powerful and unforgiving Arabic in my life, because it was just the Arabic was so beautifully classical and so abundant in my readings. I just, would often suffer from these Arabic migraines. And so one day I was downtown in Amman, and I was at a bookstore. And by here we don't mean indigo. This is a warehouse, so one floor of an entire building, full of dust and full of books. Some of them on shelves and most of them on the floor in big stacks. And in the middle of this warehouse floor, there's a guy sitting at a little table, like a little card table, drinking tea. So you'll come up to him and say, "Hey, I'm looking for this. Assalamu alaikum, brother. I'm looking for this." German edition of a 13th century mystical commentary on the Surah of Light. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, I have 2 copies left. And then he'll take you He'll take you, through this rabbit warren and move books and dust is flying, and there he is. You want both copies? And so I was in a bookstore like this, miles from the university, and I was talking to the guy, with the tea and the table. You're that American guy who's studying with this professor and that professor and this other professor up at the university. And in these moments you can't hide. So then well, yeah, that would be me. And so the Middle East remains a place where people make it their business to know everything they can about you, because this is how they place you. It's how they know where you fit within their world. And so if we roll the clock back 1400 years and we take ourselves back to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, when he was hanging out with his friends in his adopted hometown of Medina, the people that were close to him knew everything about him. They knew his manners, they knew his many aspects of his private life. They knew everybody he knew. And one day he was sitting with his friend, and a stranger walked up. This is already a big deal. The stranger, they say, was old and white, dark hair. He came up to him and greeted him as if he knew him. Assalamu alaikum, ya Muhammad. Peace be upon you, Muhammad. And he sat down, and it was right in front of the Prophet, of course, said, Salam, upon you be peace. He sat down and he said, tell me about Islam and Islam. And so the Prophet, upon him be peace, explained to him the different aspects of embodied practice that Muslims do. We call these sometimes the 5 pillars of Islam: prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, the public bearing of witness. He explained all of these points to the visitor, and the visitor said to him, that's right. And of course, the companions, the friends, who's it? They had come with considerable sacrifice to believe that this was God's messenger, God's prophet on planet Earth, and now someone is telling him whether he's right or not in matters of religion. And then he said, tell me about that iman, tell me about faith, what you believe. He said, well, we believe in God, of course, and we believe in the angels, and we believe in all the books and all the messengers. And he went on to explain the very basic nuts and bolts of Muslim belief. So what we might say, after having discussed the physical embodied dimensions of the faith, then he went on to talk about the rational dimensions, those building blocks which Muslims really don't think of as beliefs so much as they think of them as facts, right? These are the basic facts of their worldview. And again, Muslims said, that's right. They said, tell me about al-ihsan. Tell me about beautification. They said, beautification is worshiping God as you see. Of course, you can't see. So you worship God knowing God sees you. And the exchange went on a little bit. He said, tell me about the end of the world. Tell me about the hour. And Muhammad said, the person who's asking doesn't know any more than the person who's being asked. And they had a little exchange. And then, Assalamu alaikum, the guy left. But of course, the companions are just overwhelmed with their curiosity, because being who they are, Middle East, good Middle Easterners, they're dying to know, who this guy was and how he knew Muhammad, upon him be peace, and all of that. He said, do you know who that was? I said, no, tell us. He said, that was Gabriel. He came to teach you guys about your religion. Now, whether or not Gabriel was actually physically in Medina, we have no DNA evidence to verify. But what's more instructive for us is that Muslims believe in the validity of the story. And so they believe in the determinative power of this description of their faith as a collection, a weaving together of embodied practice, rational beliefs, and this mysterious thing that sometimes is translated as righteousness, but it really means the act of making something beautiful or being beautified. And so those physical embodied practices over time give rise to what we call the madhahib, that is, the schools of Islamic legal thinking in terms of regulating and optimizing a human being's actions and interactions in the world. We call this the science of fiqh, right? The human science of jurisprudence, which is based upon scholars' perception of an ideal way of living, that we call sharia, an ideal way of living and trying to apply that ideal in the mess of imperfect human life. That's the science we call fiqh. And we have many schools of fiqh within Islam. The rational beliefs gave rise to theological discussions and debates and led to various schools of what we call Islamic theology or kalam. And this led to the working out of the authoritative creeds, both of the people who came to call themselves the Sunni Muslims and also those who came to understand themselves as Imami or Shia Muslims. And then this final dimension, without which the embodied practice and the rational beliefs cannot be made whole. This final dimension was always a little trickier. The scholars always understood that this idea of worshiping God is if you see Him and then, barring that, you worship God knowing that God sees you, led to a long and introspective process of coming to understand that the beautification of the human being, the restoration of the human being, can only ever be discovered or cultivated with an acute and cultivated awareness of God's ever presence, coming very close to what my sister here mentioned. And so the idea of cultivating an ever-present awareness of God's ever-presence is easily said, more easily said than done, of course. And so there did emerge over time these schools or methodologies for the promotion of this awareness and the beautification that naturally results. I often ask people, if you're aware of God's presence, your internet surfing changes. If you are actively cultivating an awareness of God's ever-presence, your marital argument is going to change. These moments of anger or these moments of spontaneous, impulsive behavior, everything begins to change and become beautified when the human being is aware of her place in the presence of the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the orchestrator, as we say, Rev'd Glenda, the orchestrator of all the worlds, of all realities, including the reality of this moment. And so those different methodologies for the beautification and restoration of the whole human being came to be called the ways of Sufism. The plural of tariqah, or the idea of, these became what sometimes we wrongly call the brotherhoods, but they become the lay orders of these different groups which follow different theories and different methodologies for the cultivation of this sense of God's ever-presence and the beautification that naturally, organically emerges when a human being lives that way. The Quran acknowledges very clearly that it's possible to be a person who prays and believes, and yet is really a nasty human being. In Surah Al-Ma'un, the Quran says, woe to those who worship. You know, we often worry about whether God is listening to our prayers, and I always tell my brothers and sisters in the community, it's not that God, we should never worry about whether God is listening to our prayers. The Quran wants us to listen to our prayers. And so the Quran says, woe to those who are worshiping and yet are heedless of what their prayers actually mean. Those who are seen to be doing all the pious things and yet are neglecting to do basic acts of benevolence, like feeding the poor and taking care of the weak. And so prophetically and Quranically we can say that there is an awareness in our faith that physical practice and even creedal correctness are not sufficient for this project of restoration of the human being. Because I think really all these Abrahamic faiths, whether we speak in the language of Tikkun Olam, the repairing of the world, or whether we speak in the language of this idea of beautification, the whole project is about the restoration of the individual, the restoration of the community, and the restoration of the world into a state that we can't even begin to imagine. this Quranic mystery, the ahsani taqweem, the best of all beautiful forms. The best of all forms. This is so for the human being, Quranically, to be a human being is something so incredible that according to the Quran, even the angels were commanded to bow down before Adam. And when God asked the angels just prior to that command if they knew anything about the names, they said, we only know what you've taught us. And so he tells Adam, tell them the names. And some commentators say, well, this was the knowledge of the creation. You know, that's a tree, that's a flower, that's a that's a laughing thrush, and that's a pheasant. But the Quran doesn't say the names of the things in the creation. And many mystical scholars and Quranic interpreters say that it wasn't the names of the things in the creation, but it was God's names. That it was the incredible thing about the human being is that we were invested with an understanding and a capacity to reflect God's qualities. And it was because of that that the angels were commanded to bow down. And so when we talk about mysticism in Islam, there's no way for us to talk about it without this core concept of the beautification of the human being, the restoration of the human being. A restoration which doesn't bring us back to a place that we remember, but a restoration which exalts us to a level that we can't even begin to know. And this is not a calling for an elite, select group. It's the calling of God to all humankind. And so when we talk about the roadmap for mysticism within Islam, the idea of that there is a path of spiritual, of psycho-spiritual transformation where our vices can become transformed alchemically into beauties and virtues and divine qualities. That psycho-spiritual process is noetic, as William James said, the mystical experience is. It does impart a kind of knowledge, but it's not a knowledge that can be put in books. It's only a knowledge that can be garnered or gained through God's intervention in your life. As Al-Ghazali, one of our great sages who has become a very powerful and lifelong teacher of mine, says, it is a light that God illumines in the heart. And it is a light that brings certainty and knowledge, and it is not something which can be recorded into books. And even if it could be recorded, it is forbidden to even try. Because it would look like blasphemy to the vast majority of readers. And so mysticism within Islam is really about walking a path of radical transformation and ennoblement and beautification. And of course, it leads to a place where the divine qualities become the roadmap for one's own education, meaning using it here in the Greek sense, and also the Quranic sense of being led out of the darknesses, which are plural, and into the light, which is singular. And so the divine qualities then become roadmaps for our own instruction and perfection. As the Prophet, upon him be peace, is reported to have said, clothe yourselves with the qualities of God. In another tradition, he said, whoever comes to know even one quality of God and puts it into action, that person will be in God. And so when we talk about a long tradition of mysticism within Islam, we often are tempted to speak of it in terms of the Sufi orders and the rise of Sufism, and of course, Coleman Barks' his renditions of Rumi are, I think, the best-selling poetry in North America right now. And so we've all had a glimpse of that and a taste of that. And it's beautiful and it's powerful, even if in its, American free verse translations. But we should also be humble enough to acknowledge that mysticism is at the very heart of what it means to be walking this path this path of restoration leading to our ultimate home, our ultimate origin, our ultimate place of teleological fulfillment. That is the ultimate purpose of our being here. This is the reason for which we were made. And so there's no way for us to speak about mystical prayer, by which I mean now personal prayer. Prayer that illumines our life and illumines our heart and offers insight which we did not garner from a book or from a teacher. And there is no way for us to live our religion without this personal dimension. And so then, mysticism within an Islamic practice, I think, is not only something that we would regard as being fundamental and essential, because doing the ritual acts and believing, having the right aqidah is so clearly insufficient when we go back to the prophetic descriptions of the faith and the Quranic descriptions of the faith. But there's no way for us to divorce this from joy. There's no way for us to divorce this from knowledge. There's no way for us to divorce this from a kind of personal authority, which I think is really one of the most subversive aspects of the mystical experience, is that it offers a kind of knowledge that is not mediated through the ecclesiastical power of the local ulama, the local scholars in Islam, or the church, or any other body. It's a direct experience. It's a direct experience of knowledge and illumination that the person, when upon receiving it, knows that things cannot be otherwise. And so, in order to protect that, and acknowledging the danger of this, these schools or Sufi lay orders emerged as a way of trying to protect people from all the things that can go wrong within a person's journey into these realms of psycho-spiritual experience. And so there is an acknowledgement, they say, an acknowledgement of the danger of mystical experience, which is isolated from community. So community is so important because community helps us integrate and understand what we experience in these moments of personal illumination. There's no way for us to speak of this divorced of joy, as we saw so beautifully present in those poems that you read. I'll have to get those names before we depart. But all in all, I think, the entirety of the mystical experience has to be understood as Islamically, Quranically, prophetically, as the fundamental process by which we, one soul at a time, that fundamental process by which we enter into a very personal and transformative relationship with a God for her own reasons, his own reasons, as my son likes to say, its reasons. A God that is outside of time and outside of gender, and a God who, for its own mysterious reasons, has taken an interest in us, a loving interest in us. So much so that we have in this one theopathic hadith attributed to the Prophet, a hadith Qudsi, where God is believed to have said, "The moment my servant remembers me, I am remembering him. The moment my servant speaks of me, I am speaking of him. The moment my servant takes a step toward me, I am rushing toward her."